Hi, I'm Scarlett. I'm the Frugal Cook, and today we're going to be making pheasant bread, which is a very inexpensive, cost-effective, no-knead bread. It can be from mixing bowl to the table in about 4 hours. So if you start it by noon, you'll have it ready in plenty of time for dinner. First, a quick word about yeast. I buy it by the pound in bulk. If you're going to make very much bread, that is the most frugal way to buy it. You keep it in the freezer and it'll last longer. My yeast that I'm using today is instant yeast, but I still always proof it in warm water, just to make sure it's still alive, because there's nothing worse than going through a whole loaf of bread and then finding out you had dead yeast. Your water should be warm but not hot. If the baby would take a bath in it, it's about perfect. Okay, so the pheasant bread is a very simple bread, and the basic ingredients, we'll start with our yeast and water. It's 2 cups of water, 2 tablespoons of sugar, and 2 teaspoons of yeast. I always start with this and let the yeast begin to proof while I get my other ingredients ready. So we'll just set this aside and hopefully it will proof fairly quickly for us. The sugar actually serves to feed the yeast. It's more for flavor than anything. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do while our yeast is proofing is this is 4 cups of flour. I'm using white flour. I have not tried whole wheat flour in this recipe, but I do intend to. One of these days I'll have a video on that. So the flour, the sugar, the water, and just a couple of teaspoons or so of salt is the base of this recipe. And if you wanted to, you could have a loaf of bread just from that. But I like to add a little more to this bread for flavor. Today I'm making an Italian style bread. So I've got a teaspoon or so of garlic salt, a teaspoon or so of onion powder, and a little bit of Italian seasoning that I'm going to go ahead and stir in there. And then my family's favorite part of this is I add about 1/4 of a cup to 1/2 of a cup. It kind of depends. I wouldn't go over 1/2 a cup of cheese. Today I'm using mozzarella, but I would just as easily use cheddar. It doesn't really matter. I just use what I have in the fridge. Okay, so our yeast is proofed, and you can tell because it gets a little foamy on top. I don't know if you can see that or not, but you'll get a little bit of foam on top of the water. I go ahead and give it a quick stir before I pour it in, just to mix the sugar and everything on in there. Good. And then for this bread, you just pour it into your bowl. From there, this bread, all you do is stir it. This is, like I said, a no-knead bread. So we're just going to mix these ingredients up really well. And once we get them mixed up really good, we're going to move on to the next step, which is putting them in the bowl to rise. Okay, one thing that does affect bread baking greatly is humidity. You'll find the amount of water that works one day and the amount of water that works the next are not quite exact. If you can see, my dough here is still really dry even after my 2 cups of water. It's too dry, and this usually is a little bit of a moist dough. So I'm going to add a little water at a time and just mix that in until I get the desired consistency of my dough, which just do it a little bit at a time. You're not going to overstir this recipe. It's not going to hurt it a bit to stir it a little extra. It's not going to help it, but it's not going to hurt it either. So I'm just going to keep going with this until I get more of the consistency that's right for this loaf of bread. You don't want it to be watery, but you don't want it to be really dry either. This consistency is getting pretty close to about right now. It's wet, definitely, but it's not liquidy. It's just a really wet, sticky dough right now. From there, I'm going to take a big bowl, big enough for this to double in size. It doesn't always quite double, but that's a good rule of thumb with bread dough, is doubled in size. I'm going to spray this pan, and I'm going to use just whatever cooking spray that you like to use. I don't use the kind with flour in it. I just use regular cooking spray. And then we'll just dump this right out of this bowl. And scrape it all out of there. You won't get all that goody into your loaf of bread. You don't want to leave too horrible much in the bowl. From there, I'm going to cover it with plastic wrap, and we're going to let it rise anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours. Since this is a no-knead bread, 2 hours will save time on the second rise. If you do 2 hours now. So in 2 hours we'll come back and we will put this in our pans that we used to cook it in, which are actually 2 oven-safe clear glass bowls. There is a popular brand out there. I don't know how many other brands there are. I always just use the most popular one. Those bowls, I actually got mine secondhand at the thrift store for very little money, and they are not great big bowls. They're the number 2 size in the popular brand. So when we come back and our bread's risen, it will go into these 2 bowls and it'll rise again and it will bake. Okay, so we're back with our pheasant bread that's been rising. And we are just going to get our glass baking bowls ready. I've gotten one ready, but what you want to do here is just use some butter. A tablespoon or so will work. You can't really over butter it. It adds flavor. I highly suggest using real butter for this. It's a little bit more expensive, but quite frankly, that's all we use. The flavor's better, and I've been hearing, I don't know how true it is, that margarine is one ingredient away from being plastic. I don't know if it's true or not, but we know that butter is made naturally from cow's milk, so anything natural I tend to believe is better for us. So real butter is about all I ever use. And in this recipe, you really, really want to use real butter because it's going to make the difference in the flavor. Then I'm going to just grab my bowl of risen dough. It's risen quite a bit. It's still pretty wet, and it's bubbly. And I'm going to I just use a couple forks because it's real sticky. And I kind of divide it in 2. I don't stir it or anything. I just kind of try to divide it as equally as I can into 2 blobs. And I just put some in each bowl. It doesn't have to be perfect, but of course we want to get them pretty close because we want them to cook at the same rate. This one looks like it has a lot more in it, so I'm just going to play with it, and I'm going to take some of it out. Now we're going to let this rise again once we get these bowls fairly even. We're going to let this rise again for 30 minutes to an hour until it's risen again in our bowls. While that's happening here in a few minutes, I'm going to turn my oven on and preheat it to 450 degrees because that's where the first stage of baking this bread is going to leave us, is at 450 degrees. We'll bake it at 450 for 15 minutes, and we'll turn our oven down. We'll turn our oven down to 375 for another 15 minutes. And at that point, we will have bread with any baking instructions. Of course, you kind of have to check it to make sure that it was done because all ovens vary and all that good stuff. Some people's are more exact on temperatures than others. So I'm just going to loosely cover this and allow it room to rise. And then as soon as it's risen again, I will be back to show you what it looks like. Okay, so I'm back here with the finishing touches of our pheasant bread. And this is a test of whether we buttered our bowl well enough. If we've buttered our bowl well enough, it's going to just come right out of the bowl when we turn the bowl upside down on a cooling rack. So we're going to just turn it upside down on the cooling rack. And then the bowls should just pull right off. Now these are a little bit different shaped loaves than what we're usually used to. But they cut very nicely. And they work really well. They're just cut nicely and be done. You can see how the cheese in them is a little bit browner than the rest of the loaf, but that's just the nature of the cheese and the way the cheese baked. we're going to let these cool just slightly so they'll still be warm, and then we will try our bread, and it will be delicious, I promise.